Hey, what's up guys, it's Nick2. A ton of you guys recently have been asking me to make an updated version of my Shadow Rogue build using Shadow Clone, because a lot of you guys really just prefer Shadow Clone, and Shadow Clone is honestly incredibly powerful for giving you unstoppable, mimicking a lot of your damage, which really just helps you overall. But the best thing that Shadow Clone is used for is really just nuking bosses. It's fantastic for that. Towards the end of the video, I'll talk about my feelings about Shadow Clone versus Death Trap if you're interested in that. In no way, shape, or form is this video going to replace the Death Trap version. There's just a lot of people that really like Shadow Clone, so I figured I would just make a version for those people. This version is also just a little bit easier to set up for those of you guys, and I use it a ton, leveling up all the way to level 100. It is still an absolutely fantastic build. It's really nice having just a massive amount of single target damage with the setup. I wouldn't really recommend using this build pushing like really high nightmare tier dungeons. Once the mobs get like 20 levels higher than you, the build definitely starts to fall off, but up until that point and just leveling up, this build is fantastic for just blasting through everything, as you can probably tell in the gameplay. If you're looking for something that's just going to be super easy to set up, deal an absolute ton of damage, and also help you quickly and efficiently farm things, this is the build that you're going to be looking for. There will be some gameplay at the end, and I'll also talk about my feelings about Death Trap versus Shadow Clone. Also, make sure to check out the website, link in the description. There will be a full written version of the build, so you guys can very easily reference legendaries, Paragon board, etc. So let's get into it. First off, let's talk about the skills. Obviously, Puncture for the vulnerable application here on single target. Without it, we don't really have a way to apply vulnerable, so we pretty much need this for single target fights, and it gives us a little bit of energy anytime that we happen to run out of energy. Then we're going to be using Twisting Blades, obviously, because this is a Twisting Blades build. I will be uploading a Flurry build tomorrow, so make sure to subscribe for that. And then, of course, we're going to be using Dash and Shadow Step. Shadow Step is our unstoppable crit chance debuff. Stuns enemies pretty good. Dash is fantastic mobility. If you want more survivability, you could swap Dash to Dark Shroud or something, but that's not what we're doing today. And then Shadow Imbuement, you guys know how much I like Shadow Imbuement. Really great for just nuking packs, and then we're going to be pairing this with Shadow Clone to just make us do a whole bunch of additional damage. Unfortunately, this build is not as good as it used to be because Advanced Twisting Blades got nerfed, so the cooldown reduction is significantly worse than it used to be. To mitigate this fact, we are using Preparation the majority of the time, so that anytime that we use our Shadow Clone, it's instantly going to reduce the cooldown of all of our other skills. This is really nice for Shadow Imbuement resets, so basically what you can do is you pop the Shadow Imbuement, go into combat, you now have 2 charges of it, and then you Shadow Clone, and then when you Shadow Clone, it's going to reset your Shadow Imbuement again. So you can just Shadow Imbuement way more often, and it also just helps for the mobility, but it really is unfortunate not having as much cooldown reduction, and in my opinion, it makes Rogue just not feel as smooth, but there really isn't all that much you can do about it. Pretty much every build that uses Twisting Blades is hit pretty hard with this, so we're using Preparation to help us with this. It also just really increases our Shadow Clone uptime. Without Preparation, your Shadow Clone isn't going to be up that much because, again, the cooldown reduction inherently from Twisting Blades is pretty weak at this point. Anytime I fight a boss, I switch to Inner Sight. This is not hard at all. You just open the menu, boom, Inner Sight, fight the boss, and then if you're just doing some other combat, boom, you just open up Preparation. A lot of people keep asking me, hey, is my Preparation not activated when I close my UI? It's not hovered anymore. Don't worry, it's just a UI bug. It still is going to be activated for you, and you can very easily tell by just using your ultimate skill, and then everything else will go on cooldown. But anyways, feel free to use Inner Sight if you prefer it, of course, and you need the energy gen, but Preparation is your best bet for overall consistency. When it comes to the skill tree here, I'm going to max out Puncture for the Vuln, max out Twisting Blades, obviously. You could decide to swap Advanced Twisting Blades. I still think it is helpful for cooldown reduction, but you could swap it to the Guaranteed Days, which has its own merits, I guess. 30, and Siphoning Strike for the healing, and the survivability is very good. Shadow Step maxed out. 1 point to concussive, and then 1 point to trick attacks. This is because we are going to be dazing a lot with one of our legendaries, or you could obviously daze with improved Twisting Blades. So we get pretty much perma knockdown on a lot of elites, which is pretty helpful. Pretty much our only form of CC with this build, which is another reason this build is not really good for nightmare pushing because you kind of lack CC. This build is just really good for leveling up and just blasting. So Weapon Mastery for extra damage, Dash for the crit debuff. I don't go for the slow, but you could drop 1 point out of Shadow Imbuement if you want more CC and go for the slow there. 3 points into Exploit, 3 into Malice, and then I level up my Shadow Imbuement a pretty good bit. I have some ranks, so I leveled this up 3 times. I have some ranks with my helmet. Then you get the Vulnerable Explosion, which is very nice. And then one of the better parts about Shadow Imbuement is you get 30 energy anytime you kill an enemy with shadow damage, which happens all the time, so this is pretty much your main energy source. And 3 points into Precision Imbuement for extra crit. I have 3 points into Frigid Finesse here, but you only want to use this if you're using the Penitent Greaves. The Penitent Greaves is a massive increase for this build. It is these boots right here. Try to get this as soon as humanly possible. Until you get that, you want to drop the points out of Frigid Finesse, just max upgrade your Shadow Imbuement, and then put 1 point into the Discipline Dash. Let me go for Shadow Clone here and Supreme Shadow Clone, 3 points into Innervation, and then 1 point into Adrenaline Rush and 3 into Haste for the extra movement speed. One benefit to playing Shadow Clone is we no longer have to take exposure for our trap cooldown reduction. Instead, we can do close quarters combat or momentum. Momentum is great for overall movement speed and giving you damage reduction, but close quarters combat is probably one of the best things that Rogue has that pretty much nobody uses. Anytime you damage a close enemy with a marksman skill or a cutthroat skill, you grant an attack speed bonus to yourself. You can get 2 different attack speed bonuses by just using a marksman and a cutthroat skill. Puncture is a marksman skill, and Twisting Blades is a cutthroat skill. So you pretty much have 20% attack speed permanently, and while you have 20% attack speed, you also deal 20% increased damage against crowd-controlled enemies. 20% increased damage is unbelievably powerful, and the attack speed feels fantastic, so this is incredibly good for us. You could decide to try out Victimize if you wanted for just a little bit of extra damage, but I don't know. Close quarters combat, if you are CCing enemies, which you should be the second that you get the Greaves, is unbelievably strong. When it comes to our legendaries, I'm kind of just going to speedrun this. Again, make sure to reference the website for a full list of good legendaries, but you pretty much can use the same legendaries that you use on the Death Trap build. These builds are pretty much interchangeable with one another. The only thing different is a couple skill points and the Paragon board, but the legendaries that you care about are the Twisting Blades Orbit. Make sure this is on your crossbow so that you get the additional effectiveness. Aspect of the Umbral, as long as you are crowd controlling enemies, which you should be doing fairly frequently with the Penitent Greaves, and with the Daze legendary gives you a ton of additional energy. Currently, Edge Master's aspect is disabled. Hopefully this gets re-enabled. When it does, you will want to put this on and just put it in place of Conceited. I have Conceited currently paired with Temerity, but I think that this is probably not ideal. I think at some point you want to swap Temerity off, and then I would just put the Disobedience roll there, and I'd probably put Edge Masters on the neck for the additional effectiveness. Sorry, this is getting a little convoluted. This is kind of just how the game is at the moment, because this is literally disabled. It doesn't do anything right now because it was bugged. But again, check the website for a full list and how you want to set things up. Vengeful is unbelievably powerful for the 9% increased critical strike chance there, and Accelerating is very good for extra attack speed. One of the most mandatory ones is Aspect of Might for damage reduction, and Cheats for even more damage reduction against crowd-controlled enemies. You can get both of these from the Codex, so definitely make sure to plop those on if you're having survivability issues. And also Disobedience, the amount of armor that you get from this is literally over the armor cap, so this is really good. And like I mentioned before, we have the Daze, and then I have the 2 uniques. If you're having a hard time getting Aspect of the Umbral, there's one legendary that gives you increased energy generation whenever you kill an enemy that is vulnerable. Make sure to plot that on instead, otherwise your energy is going to be a little bit sad. When it comes to the rolls that you want in each piece, on your helmet you want Ranks of Shadow Imbuement, Cooldown Reduction, Max Life, and Dexterity, so I pretty much have the God Roll helmet. When it comes to the chest, you want damage reduction and damage reduction from close, and then you can either get armor, cutthroat skill damage, or damage reduction from distant. Those are your best rolls. On the gloves, you want crit chance, Ranks of Twisting Blades, these are incredibly important, and then attack speed. Outside of that, you can get like Dexterity would be pretty good, but make sure at the very minimum you get Ranks to Twisting Blades and critical strike chance. For the pants, I'm using Temerity because I'm pairing it with the Conceited aspect for a little bit of extra damage, but later into the game, I think I'm going to swap this off to some better pants that have straight up just damage reduction from close enemies, max HP. That's overall just going to be better for me, and then I can swap around my legendaries, which I was kind of referencing earlier, and a lot of people just have a really hard time getting these, so just try to go for normal pants and just put on like some defensive legendaries. Penitent Greaves is something that I'm pretty sure you're always going to want to use. Unfortunately, you lose the double Shadow Step legendary, which is what I would use instead of these boots. You could instead put that on the neck if you really wanted, whatever, but the boots give you pretty much infinite crowd control. You just walk over enemies and you instantaneously chill them, so you can take advantage of all of your damage versus crowd controlled, which we have a lot of with this build. I have 185%, but we have a ton in our Paragon board and a lot of other synergy, so these boots are pretty broken. They give you a ton of movement speed, which is really nice, crowd control duration, which is insane, and you also just deal 10% more damage straight up, so that's really good. On your two-hander, you want to have a crossbow because this rolls double vulnerable. So you want double vulnerable, and then you want dexterity, crit damage, and then for the last roll you want core skill damage or close range, but getting the double vulnerable and the crit damage is the most important thing. Those are really, really good rolls. For your weapons, you want swords because swords always roll with crit damage, which is just better than if you were to have a dagger. And also it works better with weapon mastery, giving you just straight up extra damage. For your swords, you want it to roll double crit damage, vulnerable damage, and then dexterity, and then you want an assortment of damage to close or core skill damage wherever you can. But again, the crit, vuln, and the dexterity is the best that you can get there. For your rings, you want a trifecta of crit chance, crit damage, and vulnerable damage. For the fourth stat, you probably actually want max life. That's just going to help you with your survivability a ton. Alternative to max life, you could just get like shadow damage here for your shadow imbuement, I think you can get like energy regeneration, maximum energy. There's not a ton of stuff that's particularly great. Damage to chilled is okay, damage to CC'd. But honestly, getting the trifecta of vulnerable damage, and crit chance, as hard as it is, make sure to at the minimum get crit chance and vulnerable damage, because it's very difficult to come by crit chance, and vulnerable damage is just so good. When it comes to the amulet here, you pretty much need the cooldown reduction, or else the build is just going to feel terrible not having a lot of the cooldown reduction. But the most important thing is getting 3 ranks of something that actually helps you. The best 3 ranked things that you can get are going to be Frigid Finesse if you are using the boots, or alternatively Malice, which is very good. Multiplicative increased vulnerable damage is fantastic, or 3 ranks to Weapon Mastery, especially paired with swords. Outside of that, getting damage reduction straight up or damage reduction from close is very powerful. Percentage dexterity is alright, but I would definitely go for cooldown reduction, and then ranks to, Weapon Mastery, Malice, or Frigid Finesse. When it comes to the Paragon board, again, this will be on the website, and how you want to set it up while you are leveling is going to be different than how you want to set it up when you're actually at level 100. I'll briefly go over things, but definitely make sure to check out the website because it's way easier to convey everything in a written format. But getting into it, in the first board here, I went for closer, mainly for the additional damage reduction here. The Cutthroat skill damage is decent, but it's really good for the survivability. In the second board, I actually went for Exploit Weakness to just do extra damage. There's a ton of vulnerable damage nodes in here, which is pretty insane, so I wanted to grab all this vulnerable damage. And then I slotted in Control, which is pretty powerful. My Control isn't leveled up very much, so I don't have rank 15 to get all these extra intelligence nodes, but once I did, this would be way more damage. But this is good for Penitent Greaves. If you do not have Penitent Greaves, I would probably swap this out for something like Chip, but honestly, these are really not all that powerful. I mainly just really like this board for the vulnerable damage here. However, if you are leveling up, you do not want the Exploit Weakness board to be your second board. You want the No Witness board to be your second board so that you can get Exploit. We have Exploit up here, which is our guaranteed vulnerable application, which is unbelievably broken, and you just get straight up vulnerable damage by using this, so this is incredibly powerful. The nodes on here kind of suck, so if you're not level 100, definitely do the No Witness board first, and then you pretty much want to path and grab Exploit immediately, then path towards No Witness, and then you want to immediately path into Cheap Shot here, because this is just a whole bunch of extra damage. If you're using Penitent Greaves, if you're not using Penitent Greaves, Cheap Shot is not as good, and you want to just grab the Glyph, and you want to level up combat as soon as humanly possible, because 66% crit damage with core skills is unbelievably good. And then you just want to grab all the intelligence nodes around here. You can also get a ton of damage versus crowd controlled, which is really, really great on this board, but that's not really going to synergize that well unless you're using the Penitent Greaves. Then for our last board, because I already mentioned Exploit, we're going to be using the Tricks of the Trade board. The stats on here are kind of bad. It's pretty nice though because it's low point investment to get to the Glyph, and there's enough strength here to where we can level up Turf. I would consider actually swapping this board out because a lot of the stuff here isn't that good. I like the crit damage up here. I think that this is really strong, and the damage to close enemies, like this board isn't bad. It's just not like super powerful. But honestly, there really isn't much else that's all that good. But Turf is nice for the damage reduction and just the straight up extra damage to close enemies. Now I'm just going to show some gameplay for you guys and just talk about my feelings about whether or not you want to use Shadow Clone or Death Trap. So generally, I think that Death Trap is stronger at the moment. It's better for just nuking enemies, and because of all of the cooldown reduction nerfs that Twisting Blades received, Death Trap is better for taking advantage of preparation, because you can get the cooldown way lower than you can with Shadow Clone because of the way that exposure works with cooldown reduction resetting. And also you can get trap skill cooldown reduction as a separate role in addition to normal skill cooldown reduction. But also Death Trap inherently has a 10-second reduced cooldown with just how it works. So you can get Death Trap to realistically like a 17-second cooldown and just spam it like a psycho, and it literally just nukes everything for you, and it also resets prep. So that's why I think that Death Trap is generally better. Shadow Clone is infinitely better for fighting bosses because it just does a crazy amount of damage for bosses, while Death Trap isn't really used for bosses. Death Trap is more of like an AoE nuking thing. So yeah, that's pretty much my feelings. I think Shadow Clone is still really powerful, and I wouldn't have made this build if I thought that it was bad. Shadow Clone is really nice because it gives you the unstoppable, and it's really just fun nuking bosses, and having a little clone that follows you around and helps you out is pretty cool. Initially, I wanted this build to be with Shadow Clone back when I was, playing the beta and theory crafting and everything. But the Twisting Blades cooldown reduction nerf has just hit the build so unbelievably hard that you are almost forced into playing with Death Trap if you want to be able to consistently spam your ultimate skill. One benefit that Shadow Clone does have is that you get to take advantage of close quarters combat, and you get to swap a Paragon board so you don't have to do trap skill cooldown reduction. And because you can swap stuff around like that, you can kind of do a lot of damage, like straight up just extra damage against enemies. So that is pretty nice. But Generally, I just don't think it is as good as Death Trap. But yeah, that's going to be it for the video. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys later.